Good evening and welcome to this public conversation at Yale Divinity School. I'm Bill Gettler. I'm an Associate Dean for Ministerial and Social Leadership here at Yale. And I'm delighted to welcome guests Reverend Jennifer Bailey and Reverend Danielle Buhuro. And I'll introduce them for a minute, but let me first tell you that as applications were being received at Yale Divinity School last year, we took special note of an emerging interest that has been coming for years, but suddenly seemed remarkably stated by students saying, I really want to explore chaplaincy. Sometimes healthcare chaplaincy, but I want to explore echo chaplaincy. I want to explore prison chaplaincy. I want to explore mental health chaplaincy, a whole range of chaplaincy interest that I think we hadn't seen in such significant ways until recent years. So we wanted to explore that a bit, and we had the chance through the Transformational Leadership Program to invite two brilliant practitioners and leaders who can talk about chaplaincy with us. Reverend Jen Bailey was named a Faith Leader to Watch by the Center for American Progress. She's an ordained pastor, a public theologian, a national leader in multi-faith movement for justice in an organization called the Faith Matters Network. It's a womanist-led organization equipping community organizers, faith leaders, and activists with resources for connection, spiritual sustainability, and accompaniment. Reverend Bailey has a decade of experience in nonprofits, combating intergenerational poverty. She is an ordained itinerant elder in the African Methodist Episcopal Church and serves locally on the staff of Greater Bethel AME Church in Nashville, Tennessee. Her book, To My Beloveds, Letters of Faith, Race, Loss, and Radical Hope, is an important text for the class that began their work this afternoon and is a really good read for anybody who's interested in these subjects. She holds degrees from Tufts University and from Vanderbilt Divinity School. Jen, welcome to you.
Thank you so much.
And Reverend Dr. Danielle Buhuro is the Director of Movement Chaplaincy at the Faith Matters Network. She's an ordained clergy person in the United Church of Christ, a visionary movement chaplain who is passionate about issues of race, gender, and sexuality. Dr. Buhuro has begun an innovative clinical pastoral education program with a focus on justice-oriented clinical work settings that prepares chaplains for board certification, and it's a program that takes place entirely online for the CPE part of things. Dr. Buhuro's book, Spiritual Care in an Age of Black Lives Matter, addresses issues of chaplaincy and faith in these times. Dr. Buhuro attended Chicago Theological Seminary, where she earned a Master of Divinity and a doctorate degree, and she's currently also doing doctoral studies on issues of social media identity, violence, and pastoral theology. It's such a joy to have you both with us at YDS this week. We've had a great afternoon start. Our class has gathered with us, as well as some other visitors, so we're so glad that you're here. Our subject for tonight is talking about the signs of the times and chaplaincy in the midst of these interlocking crises of the present moment. We are living through really difficult times. And what about chaplaincy might speak to those times we want to explore? We would hear a familiar list of the struggles of these days. It's been talked about a lot. COVID and all of the related pandemics and all of the hurts that we face as a society, brokenness built on years of brokenness. And some are saying there's a marked decrease in religious affiliation and participation. What's the call for spiritual accompaniment during a crisis like this one? What's that about? What do you think the need is? Maybe what do you think the possibilities are?
That's a great question. I think to diagnose the signs of the times is to pay attention not just to sort of the sociological phenomenon that's going on across issue areas, whether we're talking about climate crisis or the moment of reckoning we're in as a nation around white supremacy and white Christian nationalism, whether we're talking about the epidemic of loneliness and crisis of just folks who are experiencing severe mental health crises, especially coming out of a global pandemic that's not over yet. And one of the things that I've been mindful of the past several years is that if we tend to the root, there's a quote that I love from Adrienne Maree Brown that says, things are not getting worse, they're being uncovered, so we must hold each other tight and continue to pull back the veil. Now that we're in an uncovering moment, I think what has been uncovered is just how deeply rooted these challenges are, both in the United States and globally, and that political solutions aren't the only ways to address them, right? That the crisis we're facing, if it could just be solved by an election cycle, that would be one thing, right? But that at the core, there's an identity question afoot that is deeply tied, and I would diagnose, because at my heart, I'm a church girl, as Beyonce said on the latest album. I'm a church girl. I believe that there's a spiritual crisis afoot too, and that the problems that we're facing are not just sociological or political, but also spiritual. And so the question that becomes, at a time of increasing disaffiliation from traditional religious spaces, as we're emerging into whatever this next phase of life in the pandemic is, where folks have gotten real used to being at home and experiencing services, and folks are feeling reticent to come back in person. How do we care for and accompany folks in these moments of their lives that are so challenging as they're confronting, both in their personal lives and sociologically, all of these challenges? And so I think the call of the signs of the times are for those of us who feel called or are discerning a call towards accompaniment as a core value. What does it look like then to practice that? Do we call it chaplaincy? Do we call it pastoral care? Or is there an openness to call it something else that is still yet to be named? I believe there's lots of emerging roles that are coming up in this season that are coming to meet the signs of the times. And so chaplaincy is a term that unfortunately most people in the United States don't know what a chaplain is. I think has become sort of a place where people have projected a lot of their hopes for spiritual leadership. And usually what that means is that, and I say this as an ordained person, right? What they're trying to get at is, I believe I'm called to spiritual leadership, and I might not feel like I want to do it in a traditional parish or religious congregation. And so chaplain has become a sort of catch-all term for folks who feel called to this sort of accompaniment work, in my experience. But I'm sitting next to somebody with nearly 20 years of experience as a chaplain, and so I'm so curious what you would say.
I would say exactly what Reverend Jen has said. What is the reckoning moment? And I'm intentional about that language, is the new ways in which we are called to serve in some pretty unique, innovative ways that we've never thought about before. And I think that more than anything, it is us having to undo old ways of thinking about ministry that include old models for where ministry could take place. I really think that it's a wrapping our minds around what are the new, innovative, creative spaces where ministry is taking place. I think something that I'm interested in is digital space, for example. Now that's my PhD research, so don't steal it. But I'm interested in what are the ways in which digital space, Facebook, social media, Twitter, is the new space where spiritual care is unfolding, necessary, and needed, right? When someone posts on their Facebook, I'm really sad because I didn't get the job, or my mom died, or I'm really sad because I had a tough day at work, or I'm really sad because I experienced this crisis, whatever this crisis was, right? The ways in which community comes around that person. For me, I'm starting to see that that's an example of a new space where spiritual care unfolds, right? And so when we think about chaplaincy and spiritual care, as Reverend Jen said, what are the ways in which we can be a bit unorthodox in how we see spaces and places for providing care?
Ooh, you're shaking the table, Doc, because I can hear the voice of my grandmother. Passed away last year, 89, a good missionary Baptist woman raised in Georgia, saying, what you mean you can't go, you ain't going to the church house, right? And there's a question afoot about then what is the function of congregations and space at a time when digital space is both a space of where care is happening, where community is forming, and where harm is happening at the same time. And so I think we have to really, as somebody who still is a part actively of a congregation that, you know, is the average age is 50 and up, and I just turned 35. Ain't nobody my age or younger really in the church anymore. I think meeting people where they're at, but also understanding and really reimagining what those spaces can be is going to be crucial in the 21st century, where this ain't true for the AME Church, but some of y'all's denominations don't got no members, but got endowments to last forever, right? And so then the question becomes, what is the faithful thing to do with those spaces and the signs of the times? How can churches become, or religious congregations become, centers of community where they're giving space? There's a lot of questions for me about what's up and what the function of religious space is going to be in the 21st century when we have so many people who are displaced, unhoused, in need of social services, etc.
It's a very different model of chaplaincy than the old one. As you mentioned, you spent 2 decades in hospital chaplaincy, or nearly that, and a lot of that time as an educator in hospitals. What are the different questions that are being asked now? How has that orientation changed?
It's changed in a number of ways. Primarily, I say, to be totally honest and transparent, COVID-19 has had much to do with that. There's been a fear that many persons have now from doing chaplaincy in a hospital because there's a fear that, oh, what if I catch the virus, so to speak, or become inflicted, right? And so there's a fear around going into the hospital. I also think there's a particular dynamic that says, since COVID-19 arrived, there is this push to say, what are the ways in which care is needed in these quote-unquote non-traditional settings if I'm afraid to go into the hospital? And so I think there is a dynamic of sheer creativity that many persons across the nation in seminaries and div schools are now engaging into this radical prophetic imagination of saying, okay, if I am, for whatever reason, fear could be one piece, but if I don't want to go into a hospital, where can I serve? I also think there's a sense of wanting to rage against the system, institutionalized oppression. And so for many, I would be remiss if I didn't say healthcare chaplaincy has also represented this racist, patriarchal, sexist, homophobic sense of institution where if I am not one who wears a business suit, if I am one who wears an African dashiki, will you say that I'm dressed unprofessionally according to corporate America standards? And so there's a desire for some to say, let me go into a space and place that is anti-establishment.
Yeah.
Dr. Danny, I remember we were having a conversation earlier that I thought was really fascinating, having not served in a hospital. You brought up this notion of moral injury that many hospital chaplains are feeling in a post-COVID moment. And I wonder if you might share with folks what
Yes.
you've experienced in that context.
That's been another, thank you, that's been another dynamic for many persons who have served as chaplains for several years in primarily healthcare institutions. COVID-19 has begun to shed light on racism in our healthcare profession, what Harriet Washington once titled medical apartheid in some sense. When many chaplains serve at healthcare institutions that are not adequately funded by the city or the state, and now there are only a certain number of ventilators in an intensive care unit, and healthcare doctors are playing God determining if I have 2 people who present to this emergency room with COVID-19, and these 2 people need a ventilator, and we only have 1 ventilator, which of these 2 persons receives it? Is it the European American male who has the great health care insurance, who works for this corporate institution, or is it the 85-year-old grandma, African American grandmother who is retired from work, has a small pension, and what some would say is, unfortunately, what some would say is closer to death. And so now there's a desire of many hospital chaplains who are in the thick of this, watching this, experiencing this.
Sitting with these families as these decisions are told to them. Yeah.
Saying that this is unjust, this is oppressive. And as a result of seeing these experiences time and time again, where medical professionals are playing God, determining who gets to live and receive this limited access to these ventilators, for example, that's creating moral injury in many hospital chaplains today, and that is experienced through depression, clergy burnout, and a desire to say, let me walk away. Let me walk away from this quote unquote healthcare chaplaincy ministry and find another space and place to provide this ministry of accompaniment.
Credentialing has always been really central to the CPE approach. And to think about chaplains working more broadly in the world, that question certainly comes up. What's the thinking about that? Who credentials if it's not the ACPE, or in addition to, perhaps?
I think that's a question that's up for conversation right now, especially as we think about, and I say this as an organization that runs one of these third space organizations through our training and movement chaplaincy that certifies people, that provides a certificate. One of the questions we're asking ourselves, especially as we're thinking about creating an online directory of folks who have either graduated from our course or who we know have served in sort of this accompaniment role for social justice movements, is how are we vetting people, right?
Yeah.
Traditionally, you would have had an institution like ACPE, where you have other bodies where folks are being held accountable. And so there's a real ethical question afoot of how do you make sure that folks are who they say they are, that you know who they're, I have a friend who often talks about in healing circles, that you know who their teachers are, that you know what their practice is, that you have seen the results of their practice and know that they're a trusted individual. Because we know all too well in the world of religion and spirituality, there are a whole lot of folks who call themselves healers who've done a lot of harm, right? When unchecked. And so I think it's really, because there's so much that is emerging right now, a question, an inquiry for folks in emerging fields of chaplaincy to really put at the center is how are we protecting people without playing such a gatekeeper role that we're preventing people from actually being able to live into their vocation. What's the difference between good gatekeeping that's for protecting folks and gatekeeping that is intended to keep people out or to make these vocational pathways inaccessible because of the hoops and the degrees that you have to accomplish? I'm not against degrees, I got some, right? But some of those steps that may be inaccessible to folks who can't afford right now to go get degree X, right? And so it's a real live and live tension I think people are experiencing.
Yeah. In addition to that, I think that we also have to come face to face with the reality that there are more than one type of credentialing body in 2022. So for the longest, we saw CPE, the credentialing body for CPE, to be ACPE, the Association of Clinical Pastoral Education. But now there's the Institute of Pastoral Care Training, IPCT. Now there's Healthcare Chaplaincy Network. Now there's these various other institutions that are very reputable, who are establishing their organizations with a different set of justice values, so that now there's no longer just this one organization. Even when we think about the credentialing body of professional chaplains, The primary institutional organization was, at one point, it used to be the Association of Professional Chaplains, but now there are other organizations that are rising in numbers for membership, the Spiritual Care Association, for example. And so we also have to grapple with, there are various avenues for credentialing, not just one institutional organization. The other question that is, I think, the more difficult, harder question to ask is, there are some spaces and places where persons are saying, I don't need the credentialing. Because let's be honest, usually most people seek out the credential because there's a belief that it will lead to a particular job. But it's hard to justify this credential when jobs are waning in this area to begin with, right? And so as healthcare chaplaincy, statistics are declining for employment opportunities. That's now having a domino effect on this credentialing dynamic.
So if
that
a job
we
is
used
not
to-
on the line, then the standard becomes negotiable, perhaps. Yeah. Let's talk about movement chaplaincy. What is movement chaplaincy?
Yeah, movement chaplaincy, as we define it at Faith Matters Network, and I'm to be very clear that we are part of an ecosystem of amazing work that is happening. So this is just our definition, but it's about the care and accompaniment of social justice movements, in particular the people who serve in those movements. So thinking a lot about what it looks like, not just to accompany, but to provide care and think about resilient strategies within movements for social change. And so we would define movement chaplaincy as sort of a long-term accompaniment strategy where things like protest chaplaincy are about how you show up in the moment and direct action, and that those are part of an umbrella of spiritual care tools and technologies that are being provided and curated in this season around accompaniment, some of which, depending on your strain and lineage, might look like healing justice strategies. Some of it might be called by another name. But I think what it's speaking to is this growing awareness that within movements for social change, there is often a replication of the very harm that people are trying to fight back against in the way that we treat each other interpersonally, because people often go into movements seeking to right a wrong, who have personally either experienced that wrong or experienced hurt. And in the absence, in some cases, of a space for spiritual fortification and formation and space to be in community, folks start playing out the very dynamics of harm that they're fighting out against one another. And so the question then becomes, what does it look like to, as we're building long-term strategies, because the problems that we're facing are indeed generational, right? How are we building the infrastructure to help people stay in this work of justice, whether that's as a professional vocation or just a theological and vocational commitment over the course of their lifetime? And that means having to tend both to the personal, the spiritual, the mental, and emotional health of folks. The other dynamic is that when you're fighting day to day against things like police brutality, that begins to take a real impact on your safety, sense of safety, of well-being. And so providing those type of care spaces, movement chaplains are meant to walk alongside folks who are experiencing some of the perhaps unresolved trauma. What I'll also say is that movement chaplaincy is not a replacement for therapy, right? That there are different roles, and part of the discernment of this moment, I believe, as these new roles are emerging, is to figure out what the boundaries are. Because as new things are new, I'm married to a psychotherapist, and I can tell you he has a whole set of skills that I don't have. As somebody who is claimed as sort of a pastoral theologian, I can give excellent pastoral care because I had good teachers. But when it comes to knowing what to do when someone's in, having experienced psychosis, right?
Sure.
Like that's just a different set of skills, resources, and training. But what I am required to do is know where those skills, those resources are for folks in the moment. So there's a piece of movement chaplaincy that I really think is about equipping people to do what Dr. Danny talks about as a community needs assessment, to know where resources are in local communities in a real deep way. And so that, as we think about movement chaplaincy, the Faith Matters Network is just a piece of a puzzle that is a growing landscape of really beautiful work out there that may not call itself accompaniment. So there are plenty of people who have been doing what I would call movement chaplaincy for decades, but haven't necessarily had a name for it. Think about the people who were making sure people were fed during the Southern Freedom Movement, right? Who stayed behind to make sure that chicken was fried and sandwiches were made and people got water and were cared for, right? But that is also beautiful labor of accompaniment, but by and large, honestly, because people saw it as women's work, right, was dismissed as not as central to some of the organizing strategies that were core or that we might have studied in our social movement classes over the years.
We're in the midst of a divinity school. We're going to turn to the divinity school in a minute to ask for their questions. But in the midst of a course of theological study, is there room for this kind of talk and training and accompaniment? Or is it an either or? That's kind of a setup. I hope there's room for it.
Let me say this. Can I say something controversial?
Yeah.
In addition to being
Please
a psychotherapist, my husband's a religious studies scholar who has a joint appointment at a divinity school right now, so please forgive me, husband, if you're watching. But yes, there is definitely space, but you know what it's not, and this is maybe not true of YDS, you're a way to recruit more students because your institution is dying. This is not your lifeline, right?
Sure.
We've had so many seminaries over the years approach F&M as we've launched this new training in 2019 to say, can you come do a D-Min and movement chaplaincy for us?
Give us reason for being.
And I'm like, I don't even know if this actually works for real yet. You know what I mean? What are we training people to do? There's not necessarily jobs. These skills are certainly transferable, but there's not necessarily jobs for a movement chaplain at, United We Dream. Think about some large movement organization, Faith in Action even, right? One of the nation's largest faith-based community organizing networks. And so that's not to diminish our work by any means, but what I'm saying is, this can't be the lifeline that theological education hangs its hat on to keep itself afloat. It has to be a space of inquiry among a larger reckoning in innovation and
but that's what I'm asking. So from the other direction, where I suppose at least the immediate future is fairly secure, does it conflict with fairly traditional theological education? I don't know if you'd call it traditional theological education, but the questions that are being asked in the academy, in seminaries and in divinity schools, how is that interpreted through a lens that is focused on accompaniment in the midst of social justice work?
Are you going to make your classes accessible to community members so they don't have to pay tuition, right? So part of what the inquiry there is about, if this is really about the work of social justice, if this is really about the work of accompaniment, then that also means embodying a certain set of core values, particularly around these courses, that makes it accessible for folks and does not provide the sort of gatekeeping that we've been talking about, right? So if you're going to do a movement chaplaincy course, then you better make sure, or a community chaplaincy course or a street chaplaincy course, then you better make it accessible to folks who are actually doing that work in the world or doing that immediate work of accompaniment, right? And if you have the resources to do so, why not?
Yeah.
And really asking yourself the question, why not, gets to some of the core value questions that are underlying what you think the purpose of theological education is.
Right.
I would add to that, I think movement chaplaincy curriculum in a seminary or div school would also look like ministry for the real world courses being offered, right? When I was in seminary, I would have loved to take a class on community needs assessments around the parish that I served, or how to do a community needs assessment around the healthcare institution where I served. And so I also think it's a shift in curriculum in terms of real ministry praxis and what are people experiencing after they graduate when they go on to pastor a church or work in ministry as a justice activist or a chaplain of some sort, right? How has the seminary prepared, or the div school prepared this student for real life ministry issues that they will encounter? And so I also think a portion of movement chaplaincy is also taking serious a U-Haul or overturn of how we've understood even just the types of classes being offered, that I think sometimes I struggle with scratching my head around saying, now how can that be useful to someone who is in the middle of an urban setting with a budget of $20,000 trying to figure out how to lead this faithful congregation.
Thank you. We've had an afternoon of this conversation with 25 or 30 YDS students. I want to turn to you and ask your questions. We're gonna spend time tomorrow in more conversation, and then we're going to have time with chaplains in 8 different contexts to talk with, to hear about their work, and to think about our own. But growing out of this conversation, what are your questions? I think we have a microphone. Is that right? Please.
I'm wondering, this is weird, but I'm kind of asking Bill, what is the point of theological education if not to do this kind of work?
It's the right question.
Like, it feels backwards to say, how is this useful for theology? What is the point of theology if we aren't meeting people where they are?
Yes.
I just, like, why is it not the Anyway, I'm confused by that. How can we make it more oriented towards justice and not towards a big pile of books?
I think that's directed more at me.
Yeah, I think so. I was going to say. I read a lot
And I think you're in the midst. I mean, I think this is a school where that effort's being made. I think that there are lots of opportunities for exactly what you're talking about. So I'm in part teasing out that possibility in theological education in general. Sure, there are folks who are here entirely for the academic exercise of theology, but there are lots of opportunities to work contextually, to work in the midst of reimagining the possibilities and learning skills for that work. But yeah, it's a right question.
And I also think it's a question that students have to also ask as they are discerning future calls to ministry, thinking about and reflecting on, is that call to ministry laced in addressing racism? Is that call to ministry grounded in addressing sexism, patriarchy, male dominance, homophobia, classism, Islamophobia? I think that's also the call for the student to also be reflecting on wherever one finds themselves in ministry. Is this a ministry identity or role that also speaks to the isms in our larger world today?
I'll share a quick story that I think may be relevant. I can remember the moment, my second year at Divinity School, I was sitting my theological ethics class. At the time, I was working 30 hours a week for a food justice nonprofit in Nashville, and was seeking ordination at a Chicago annual conference, my home conference of the AME Church. And so driving back and forth for things. And I remember, and maybe Danny will remember this because Danny's also from Chicago, but there's a young girl, maybe 6 years old, named Heaven Sutton, who got killed. Yeah. There was a shooting in her neighborhood. She was in her living room, was shot in the face and died. Heaven literally died, right? And so I remember reflecting on that driving home from some denominational meeting I had to be at, and sitting in theological ethics and reading Yoder, and having to ask myself the question, how is this relevant for the South Side and West Side of Chicago right now? What does ethics have to say about the life that heaven has been murdered, right? And so I do think there's also a part of this within theological education, which is about helping students identify for themselves how and where you want to apply it. That was the moment where I was like, I'm gonna write what I want to write, right? I'm gonna use these texts that have been provided to me so I'm fluent in the language so that people can take me seriously in certain spaces. But I'm gonna write about heaven. I'm gonna write about food justice in Nashville and people who, are in this rising it city but can't afford to feed their families. And so I do think there's a way in which taking agency over one's experience of theological education, discerning where your passions meet the isms, addressing the isms, and then saying, all right, so I'm gonna write what I wanna write in a way that reflects back and helps me get to where I wanna get.
Who else had a question? Yeah, Mike's right behind you.
So as far as the boundary and kind of play between mental health care and chaplaincy, I was curious if you could expand on that, because I'm particularly curious about the different board certifications, if that's the correct terminology, what that qualifies you to do exactly.
Board certification qualifies you to serve as a professional chaplain, right? Those credentialing bodies, those credentials that we all seek to attain in the field of chaplaincy, qualifies someone to serve as a professional chaplain. Now, the question becomes, what is the benefit of serving as a professional chaplain? And that's what many people are now finding themselves grappling with. For some, being board certified and serving as a professional chaplain means certain economic opportunities that are now afforded to one. Certain particular raises on one's job if one is currently already serving as a chaplain. There's also a greater sense of wanting to become board certified, because for some, there's this sense that chaplaincy has to be defined by a standard, the way we define medicine or law. Medicine for doctors, law for lawyers. There's a desire to say, I've always wanted to be a lawyer. I used to love watching this show in the 90s called The Practice, right? But at some point, I can't stand up and say, well, I'm going to step into someone's courtroom because God called me to be a lawyer, right? And so there's a desire for professional credentials in the field of chaplaincy. So if nothing else, we can have a standard that proves to other disciplines why we are worthy in some sense. And let me also be transparent and honest to say some of this is also about good old-fashioned job security, because there are, in healthcare institutions, for example, chaplaincy jobs that are dwindling in this competitive market that we live in. Those who are professional chaplains and have attained this certification now win out against the other person who has not achieved this standard. My sense of sadness that complicates this conversation is there are persons who are becoming professional chaplains, jumping through the hoops, jumping through the gatekeeping, and still sharing unhealthy theology at the bedside of many sick persons. And so I'm also interested in talking about what are the ways in which it can't end at just attaining a credential, right? This yearning to be justice oriented has to be something that lives in one's heart.
I want to hear you asking a question a little bit about, are chaplains trained to be mental health practitioners? I would say the answer is no, right? And insofar as chaplains are trained to tend to the spiritual, religious faith life of folks, not necessarily equipped to know what to do, again, when someone's in a psychotic state, right? And so the difference in certifications look very different, even within the field of mental health. You can be a licensed professional counselor, you can be a clinical psychologist, all of whom have some element of practice that's specifically geared towards attending to what emergent presentations of mental health crises might look like. And so I think it's interesting because it's a blurry boundary. For some folks, one's spiritual well-being and mental well-being are intimately connected. And so I'm really curious about, as we're beginning to continue to flesh out these fields, where are the boundaries? Where's the training within chaplaincy for folks to know, like, actually just suggesting we pray it away or pray, like, is not gonna help people tend to the real life and death consequences of a diagnosis. And so if they're presenting with a certain degree of anxiety or depression, right, prayer can help. Prayer changes things. Again, I'm a church girl, I believe that in terms of my own personal theology. But what happens when you're at the bedside of somebody who doesn't share your theological worldview or belief, which is increasingly the case, right, as we become a more pluralistic society? And so I'm curious, I'm very curious about this question, partially because I live with a mental health practitioner, but about where those boundaries and lines are and how we can responsibly toe them and know when something is out of our depth, which feels really hard, especially when I come from a tradition where folks don't think anything is outside the depths of the church theology, right?
That kind of delineation has long been a part of pastoral theology, and my sense certainly is that it continues to be clear in this variation on chaplaincy preparation. Yeah, that's not a blurred line.
Thank you. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about what happens when these people who are offering new and reimagined forms of the ministry of accompaniment in new spaces, when they encounter the gatekeepers and the tradition holders. Maybe, I don't know if you have examples of things that have worked, how they've navigated that, just as it's unfolding, any sort of things that might illustrate how that's being lived.
You have somebody, I can see there's somebody
Brings a
particular
smile to
in
his
mind.
I've served as a hospital chaplain since 2004. I've been a CPE supervisor since 2010. About 2 years ago, as I was working for a healthcare institution as a CPE supervisor, 2 years ago, George Floyd is murdered. And I began to have a whole Jack Mesereau disorienting dilemma around, wow, what am I doing with my life? I go to this corporate institution. I've been working there for 10 years, and I don't feel a sense of peace in my spirit about my life and my work and how my work is addressing societal ills, if you will. And so I contacted a couple of friends who are also CP supervisors at healthcare institutions. I said, we should start online CPE program that specifically places people at social justice organizations in particular and allows them to get their CPE unit at these institutions. And it'll be totally online. So therefore, anybody can be in the CPE groups, if you will, and you can serve in particular institutions in your own cities, states, and towns, wherever you live. And a few people laughed at me and said, that'll never work, that's stupid, that's dumb, and people won't sign up for that. And so I went through the accreditation process to get a center like this accredited through ACPE. And now I have a CPE center that ranges from 10 programs running consecutively three times a year, right? I have a program that has about 100 CPE students that go through the program every year. And so there's a part of me that's also wanting to invite people to reimagine and be creative, right? There's a part of me that wants to push students to create that thing that is your passion And maybe it's because I'm a hopeless, optimistic, but I really do believe in some sense what we're really having a conversation about is how are we going into ministry, creating that thing that does not already exist, and say, the divine is giving that to me, and I'm going to create it, right? Instead of simply going to grab a job that maybe doesn't speak to my passions and just grabbing that because that pays the rent. How do I really move towards that which moves my spirit, whatever that is? And so I extend the invitation to think about taking serious prophetic imagination and radical creativity and what that looks like for our calls to ministry.
Can I say a word about that too, because I think it's important. And also seek out like the elders in your life who also at one point had a radical imagination and created something out of nothing. Because I think too often, especially in the field of innovation and entrepreneurship, as somebody who has been in a fellowship with a lot of social entrepreneurs through an organization called Ashoka, right? You know, social entrepreneurship, go on your own, create your own thing. What I've learned is like, you know, the most useful conversations I've had with elders who've been there before, and people who may not have envisioned the exact thing I had, but who've started things on their own. And I think there's a way in which we are socialized to believe that we're alone or that there's nobody who has context or, and that there's something really powerful about mentorship, not in the sense of like, your mentor is trying to make you a mini them, but as a co-learning cross generations enterprise, that feels really important to me as somebody who's started my own thing and would not have been able to do it if I hadn't been in conversation with folks who had started their own things before. Because you know, there is both everything new and nothing new, right? And so it feels really important to me to say that to you, because I do think, particularly when I started Faith Matters Network, I was 25. I was right out of Vanderbilt Divinity School, and the most useful conversations I had in that first year with people in their 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s who could tell me what to do, where they messed up along the way, but also encouraged me to keep moving and to keep going as my call was evolving. So.
And that's why, in part, our conversations tomorrow are going to be with some elders who have been practicing this chaplaincy thing for a good long time in some cases. And they will move with the kinds of questions that are being asked here, and they'll have some wisdom about where they sought to make progress or change. And they'll also no doubt have stories about the systems that they're part of, and that'll be wonderful to explore.
But
yeah,
I'm trying to resist the but.
No, you can but me. Come on, this is.
And at the same time, not allowing tradition to talk you out of your dreams.
Right.
When tradition says that'll never, that'll never work. So I'm experiencing it as a both and.
Yeah,
right.
a colleague of mine who runs something called the Leadership Foundations talks about tradition theology, right? For folks who are faith inspired, that there's something about being grounded in something, whether it be your theology, your community. For me, it's the wisdom of the church mothers, right? That grounds me. While also being like, how we compost this, because some of the stuff that y'all been peddling for a long time is nothing but harmful and death dealing. And so I hear you. I'm not. We ain't disagreeing.
Right. It's a both and.
It's a both.
It's a both and.
It's a
because
both
you also
and,
can't be out solo, right? You need some support, right?
Because that's the fallacy of capitalism, would think that you have to be a rugged individual and do it on your own. And so it's living in that tension, but also being in discernment to know who the people you bring around you to help you figure out what comes next. Yeah.
Yeah.
Averin has a question then.
Good.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. My question is around kind of like, I guess, the structure of chaplaincy as it exists in our society now, and also looking forward to kind of maybe what's next with chaplaincy. Kind of, I guess I'm questioning kind of the inherent hybridity of being a chaplain, where you both are ordained within your respective denominations, but then maybe as a chaplain, you might work in a hospital or for a corporation that's separate. And so, I mean, not that your ordination is like, your master or something, but you know what I mean? Like, you can't serve two masters. How do you kind of live into a place of recognizing, yes, this is the person that pays my paycheck, this is the person that gives me my pension, but in this moment, these are the people I'm working with. Can you talk a little bit about where that tension comes up, if it does, and how you deal with it when it does? And then I guess I said it was looking forward, because I wonder if the future of chaplaincy is going to be more people that are free agents, people that are not ordained, or people that aren't using the term chaplain and are using different terms as the field evolves.
I'm looking at you because I'm not a professional chaplain.
I am same gender loving. I have a wife, and I have a 13-year-old son. And I'm laughing because I hear their voice in these moments where I hear my wife saying, "Okay, that's great, but at the same time, this rent right here needs to." This rent right here, what are we gonna do about this light bill right here? As I'm talking about prophetic imagination, and oh honey, we need to have radical courage. And she says yes. And at the same time, when we open the refrigerator, we need food in the refrigerator. So that has meant that I have picked up a job as a hospital chaplain, right? Let's be honest, I started my CPE business after I had 10 years worth of savings from working as a hospital chaplain and CPE supervisor for a hospital for 10 years, right? And so I also think, as Reverend Jen often reminds me, wonderful balance, right? There has to also be a honest question around, at the end of the day, how do you also provide for yourself, right? I have a 13-year-old son who says, yes, we can imagine, but you promised me my allowance was going to be on Saturday. So where is the allowance, right? And so I think that there are spaces and places where we do have to come to some both and conversations around, until your passion materializes to that which can financially support you. How do you wrap your mind around doing something else? Or maybe the conversation also is, oftentimes we talk about being Moses and having this call to lead people to liberation, but we don't have conversations about what are the ways in which we may be called to be Joseph, where we have to serve in the house of this oppressive system and provide justice from the inside, right? We often don't have those conversations, and so maybe there are times and spaces and places where we will be, as Esther was, serving in the house, right? In some sense, right? How do we also see healthcare chaplaincy as that as well?
I think there's also an element that I've found in my own vocational journey of being clear within yourself what your priorities are, even if. So I often say, and it might be funny for Danny to hear this, but my first and primary vocation is as a minister of the gospel. My second identity and vocation is as clergy in the AME Church. My third in hierarchy is founder and executive director of Faith Matters Network. Now, F&M is the primary side of my ministry in this season of my life, and hopefully for a long time to come. I mean, we're building some good stuff. I'm excited, working with 70% women of color. There's not many places where I get to do that, right? And I recognize the hierarchy of my call. So if ever my ordination in the AME Church got in the way, I'm like, I'm about to say this on camera? Forgive me, Bishop. But if ever my ordination in the AME Church got in the way of me serving faithfully the gospel that I believe I was called to preach and teach and be in, then I might have a real reckoning moment about whether or not I need to be clergy in the AME Church anymore. In the same way, if ever my work at Faith Matters in the Network got in the way of faithfully serving that, then there's a conversation we need to have with my board about transitioning me out of the ATM role, right? And it took me a long time to get there, especially as somebody who was formed in institutions and places that were like, I like to call it the leadership industrial complex, where, seriously, right? Where you get identified young as the, oh, I'm gonna be real blunt, as the exceptional Negro, let me be clear,
Yeah,
in certain
yeah,
spaces,
yeah.
so people deem you as special, and particularly white people deem you as special, and move you through a set of leadership programs that got me from Whitney M. Young Magnet High School in Chicago, which, where Michelle Obama went, right, to, like, I had to get into that school. Once I got into that school, I went to Tufts. Once I went to Tufts, I was identified by our now Dean of Arts and Sciences as a special person when I came in for my admissions interview. Then I was a Truman Scholar, right? There's this way that it's about training people up this ladder. And I had a breakdown when I was 24 at divinity school, like, but what is God calling me to? The fact that, the inferiority complex that I felt because I had friends who were getting their degrees at Yale Law School, but here I was doing my rinky-dinky divinity degree, right? Like, or that, I went to Vanderbilt because they offered me a scholarship, but I could have been at YDS, and I felt an inferiority complex because all my friends had Ivy League degrees, right? All of that stuff I had to deprogram to get to the core of, like, but what am I called to do? What is Spirit speaking to me? And how can I be faithful to that call no matter what? I didn't think I was going to start something right out of divinity school, y'all. I applied for a lot of jobs. The only one I got was a fellowship to help me start something. That is the true story of Faith Matters Network. United Methodist Women turned me down. My alma mater, Tufts, turned me down. And then I got this fellowship, and I'm like, well, looks like I'm starting something. Because I thought it was going to be 5 years before I started my own thing, right? But Spirit had other plans. And I was trying to lean into faithfully answering the call. So I say that to the students in the room to say, like, getting clear within yourself and paying attention to what is that core thing, that thing. Everything else. I also am not opposed to, like, if you need to work a 9 to 5 at a bookstore to pay your bills and it ends at 5 o'clock so you can spend the rest of your time doing the thing you're passionate about, that's okay too. I would love an easy job. I got a toddler at home, right? I feel called to this side of ministry in this season. So I'm just offering that as, like, as you're jumping through the hoops and discernment about certification, non-certification, what's the role? What's the role? The role isn't paying my bills, but the Spirit gives space for it, as long as you're clear within yourself around what your priorities are.
I think that's a final word. I think that's a powerful final word.
Yes, it is.
We look forward to tomorrow, more conversation. But friends, will you join me in thanking Reverend Jen and Reverend Jenny?